Chapter 40. Here we have Gottschalk, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, and he was our first real serious American composer. He actually really had a hard time breaking into the classical scene, actually. He went to Paris to study, and the book talks about this, but what the book doesn't say is that when he got to Paris, he was not accepted into the conservatory because he was an American. They said Americans go around and shoot guns and create steam engines. They are not fine classical artists. However, he had some friends over in Paris who exerted some influence over some people at the conservatory, and he did manage to get in and become quite successful over there with his music. He was known as the Chopin of the Creoles, I guess is what they actually called him, and they also kind of likened him to Beethoven upon his return to the United States. And he really was on fire for about a year or so, but then we have the Civil War. He was a Northern sympathizer, so it kind of was hard for him to be a Chopin of the Creoles when he was actually for the other side. So during the war, things were a little tough for him. And when he went out to California to do some concerts out there and kind of got into a scandal, which actually the book doesn't talk about either. But he had an affair with one of his students. So he actually left America and went to Mexico and South America, where he toured extensively down there. So really he didn't spend a whole lot of time in the United States when you consider the grand scope of his life. He ended up contracting malaria and died outside the United States, down in either in Mexico or South America. I think it was in Mexico. But his music is interesting to us because he creates kind of this unique American sound. If you think 1830, 1840, we're just past the age of Beethoven and moving into Chopin. This music is quite different than what we just listened to. It does sound very American, so I think he is an important composer to learn about and to know. And so I want to listen to the beginning of the banjo for you to hear this characteristic sound. And then we'll listen to the end where he actually quotes Stephen Foster, who we just talked about, who is our first American popular songwriter to really make a splash, whereas Gottschalk was really our first American composer to make a splash. So let's listen to the beginning of this. We can hear the left hand kind of sounds like a banjo, like the strumming of a banjo. And actually, at this point, we have a completely different melody that comes in. But what I'm most interested in now is just going directly to the coda. You can listen to this music on your own. It's actually really fun to listen to. It's a fun little piece, fun to play, fun to listen to. Let's go ahead and scroll over to the end here. There's that Camptown Races in octaves. And the upper hand, so it's the high sounds here. So that frantic pace you're hearing as we near the end is what would have been indicative of the style of the amateur banjo player down in the South at this particular time. So I really like this little piece. It's fun to listen to, it's very accessible to the audience, and it shows our American style for the first time. Here we are listening to Chopin, and next we're going to be listening to Berlioz, and we've had Hensel, we've had all these other composers from Europe. And so it's really great to hear some of our own music being performed at this particular time too. So now we're going to move on to Hector Berlioz and talk about the Symphonie Fantastique. Now, before we get into the actual piece of music, I want to actually just go over one more time about program music. We've had this in the past. Vivaldi Spring was another example of program music, but it's music that tells a story. Usually it either has a literary or a pictorial association. In the case of the Symphonie Fantastique, we actually have a story that Hector Berlioz wrote to go along with the music so that you would have a very clear picture of what he was trying to say. Absolute music would be the opposite of that, and we're going to be seeing that in Brahms here very shortly, who's our next romantic composer. But Berlioz really did a lot of work in the genre of program music. Berlioz, here's a caricature of Berlioz, a satire, if you will. Berlioz was very emotional. He was an emotional man. He created emotional music. He created a lot of passion in his music. This becomes so important in the 19th century because up until this particular time, music had a specific intent or a specific purpose up until the era of Beethoven, and that is to satisfy the requirements of a patron. And now we have these guys living on their own. Berlioz actually, his dad wanted him to be a doctor, and after he was in Paris for a while and was hearing a lot of this amazing music that was coming from the composers of the era, he decided, you know what, I really think I want to be a musician instead. So he actually dropped out of medical school and became a musician. But the problem with being a musician, kind of like today, is that you don't make a lot of money, which is okay except when you have to pay the bills. So Berlioz was successful, but not really until later in life, where he got a stipend from university to help him along. But he did a lot of different things, from writing about music to performing to composing. So he kind of took on the role of what would be the modern musician in today's world. He had a lot of different hats on at any given time. So let's look at the music of Berlioz. This Symphonie Fantastique, I think he started in 1830 and finished it in 1832. Here's his specific program. In the external links here in Unit 5, you're going to see his entire program. I ask you to read that because you're actually going to be taking on this particular symphony for your discussion board. He wrote 5 different movements altogether. They do tell a particular story. We start out with this idea called the idea fixe, which is a French, of course I don't speak it in French at all, but basically it's a fixed idea that represents the beloved, that represents his love in this particular case. It actually happens to be this woman right here. It's Harriet Smithson, who he saw in a Shakespearean role in Paris and fell in love with her. So he writes this piece of music where he believes that he has been wronged by her. She has spurned him. He is not able to get the affection that he desires from her. So as an artist, now this is just the story, as an artist who wears his heart on his sleeve, he's very, very upset that his love is not returned. So he then takes a whole bunch of opium to try to kill himself. Well, instead of killing himself, he actually just has a really bad dream. And that's what this dream is. This is this really bad dream that he has. Within it, we do have this beloved idea, this fixed idea that revolves around his love for, in this case, Harriet Smithson, but anyway, the girl in the dream, the girl in his mind. And it changes throughout the piece. Near the end, it becomes quite grotesque, and we would call this thematic transformation, where it goes from its original idea and transforms into something new. Because see, what happens is he falls in love with her. They meet here in the first movement. They go to a ball together in the second movement. They're out in the country in the third movement. But by the time we get to the fourth movement, because see, of the quiet surroundings, he's painful forebodings fill his soul. He's having these feelings of absenteeism, because after the ball, he then goes out to reflect in the scene in the field. And by the time he gets to the fourth movement, he dreams that he has killed his beloved. And at the very end of the fourth movement, you actually hear the fall of the guillotine blade. And that's actually what we're going to be listening to here very shortly. Fifth movement, he descends into hell, actually, after his death, and he meets some witches where they have quite the dance in the fifth movement. The fourth and the fifth movement are my favorite movements. I think because the way that he interprets these is so profound. It's so well done. I really think he should be called the grandfather of film music, because you just have all kinds of pictures in your mind as you listen to this. And the other kind of interesting thing about that is Stanley Kubrick actually takes part of this, actually part of the fifth movement, and inserts it into the beginning of his film, The Shining, to really set the stage for that film. And we actually talk about that and see this film in my history of film music class. And I'm so glad that it features Berlioz, because this is just so incredibly well done, which is why I want you to do it for your discussion board. So let's listen. That's still the banjo. Let's listen to the beginning of movement 4. And what you're going to hear is you're going to have, here it says this ominous drum beats. You're going to be hearing drums. You're going to be hearing brass. Actually, the horns are muted. And it's really giving us the darkness, the dark quality. And it also begins to set up the stage for a march, because what we really have is this march to the scaffold, where he's actually thinking about the fact that he is about to be put to death. It's just crazy. So let's listen to the beginning. Now, one thing I want to point out here, if we go all the way back to Purcell and we listen to the opera Dido and Aeneas, one of the things that we learned was something called a ground bass, a chromatic descent. It usually means some sort of trouble, heartbreak, death, anything sad. And you can see here we have this descending bass line. So this is used quite often in music to give us that sense of foreboding, that sense of ominous, that sadness, grief, despair. And we see this descending bass line here with Berlioz, just like we saw it with Purcell. I'm going to go on to the B section for you to hear this crazy march. Actually, we go from this ominous sounding minor mode to this upbeat major mode as this march is proceeding. So we have this back and forth. I find it to be a glimpse into the mind of this composer who's about to be put to death for killing his beloved. We're going to go from this happy mode, this moment of, okay, well, maybe everything is going to be okay after all. Then we're going to go to the end where we're actually going to hear his head being cut off. So let's go kind of a little bit farther into this near the very end. He's getting frantic. Oh no! You hear the strings playing, then the trumpets. Okay, now we're going to actually have a restatement of the beloved theme. There's this theme. Thinking of her. Now here comes the blade, and